What's up, everybody? Good afternoon. More offensive coordinator candidates coming up. We're just going to keep pushing through them until we have somebody or we run out of names. And today we've got an interesting name, a guy still in the postseason, a guy who has done a lot in a relatively short amount of time, a guy who has touched a lot of interesting elements of college and pro football over the last several years. I even remember when this guy was a player. This is T. Martin. T. Martin, currently 46 years old. He's been a lot of different places recently, and he's now starting to get offensive coordinator type attention. And I think that makes sense. If you look at the resume, it stacks up pretty well. If you look at what he's done, it makes sense that he's starting to get talk as an OC guy. So this is a guy who hasn't done it before, right? Technically, he did it in college for a little bit, but in the NFL, no play calling experience. Nope, not at all. So there's risk, but maybe risk is what we have to take. So let's go through the resume here, starting with the most recent stuff. Last 2 years, the quarterback coach for the Baltimore Ravens under Todd Monken, coaching, of course, Lamar Jackson. And Lamar Jackson has had 2 of his best years in the NFL. Not so much statistically, but in 2023, Lamar did win MVP. Whether or not he should have is a discussion that people will have for a while. I personally don't think he should have won it, but the fact that he's even in the conversation is impressive. He did have good stuff, right? 24 touchdowns, 7 picks, 3,700 yards, over 102 QB rating, ran for over 800 yards and 5 touchdowns. Like, it's not egregious that he wins it. And then 2024, his numbers go through the roof. Almost 4,200 yards, 41 touchdowns, 4 picks, 67% completion almost 120 quarterback rating. Statistically, in terms of box score stuff, maybe the greatest season any quarterback has ever had in the history of this league. Remember, he's also thrown in 900 rushing yards. Now, Lamar, I don't know if he's going to win MVP this year, but he could. And 2022, before T. Martin was the quarterback coach, it is worth noting, and I don't want to say that it's because of T. Martin, Lamar, over the couple of years before T. Martin, not nearly this good. If you look at him in 2022, he was good. You know, it wasn't special. Like, you can go back to 2021, and I think you'd say similar things. No one was talking about Lamar Jackson as an MVP winner those years. They have been these last 2. So maybe you credit Todd Monken more, but somebody's doing something right. And it's hard to say that T. Martin's doing anything wrong. So this one's interesting. That alone would definitely get my attention in a pretty positive way. The 2 years before that in Baltimore, he was the wide receiver coach, which that's not so great. The Ravens have not produced the greatest receiver production the last couple years. 2022, they did not have a single wide receiver go over 500 yards. Although part of that was because of the limitations of Lamar as a passer and the fact that Lamar missed some time. It's not just the receivers, but Demarcus Robinson and Devin Duvernay were their top 2 guys. Both guys had over 400 yards, but neither had over 500. The year before that was better, right? Marquise Brown, 1,000-yard season, 90 catches. This was Hollywood. Rashad Bateman, 500 yards. Sammy Watkins, about 400. And Devin Duvernay gave you about 300. So not terrible this year, but you wouldn't necessarily say it's a great feather in the cap for him as a receiver coach. But again, at this point in time, I don't think Lamar was a fully developed passer in a way that receivers, wide receivers, would get a lot from him. He was more of a guy who would throw to his tight ends, I think, at this time, which is why you had such great numbers from Mark Andrews and not the wide receivers. Now it feels like it's a little bit different, but T. Martin's moved on to a different role. Before his stint in Baltimore, he spent some time in Tennessee with the Volunteers, and he was the assistant head coach and wide receiver coach. Interesting 2 hats to wear. So 2019 to 2020. 2020 was the COVID year. Tennessee was bad. They were 3-7, and they didn't have any receivers go over 500 yards. That number keeps coming up. But all 3 receivers that he coached this year went on to be coveted players in the draft and relevant players in the NFL. Not hugely relevant yet, but these were all guys who were notable names in the 2020 in their respective drafts. Josh Palmer, currently on the Chargers, had about 500 yards this year. Velez Jones Jr. ended up on the Bears. He had about 300, and Jalen Hyatt had just under 300 yards. So he wasn't able to get big production out of them yet. They did end up having big production in later years, but at the same time, he's there for part of their development. 2019 was definitely a better year for the receivers on Tennessee. DeJuan Jennings, we know him. He ended up being a pretty big success in the NFL for the Niners. He had almost 1,000 yards. Marquez Callaway, I think he did a little bit of stuff with the Saints, had over 600 yards. And Josh Palmer gave you about 450, who we talked about in 2020. So, really, I'd say the work he did here was quite good. The receivers that he coached were regularly going to the NFL and having success, at least some success in the NFL. Now, sometimes that success was production, and sometimes it was just getting drafted high, but he definitely put his stamp on his time with the Volunteers. All right, before all this, we had an extended stint with him at USC. He spent a long time at USC wearing a bunch of different hats. The Trojans, he was an offensive coordinator and wide receiver coach from 2016 to 2018. And there's some pretty good stuff that he got to coach during this time. Names that you will recognize even if you don't watch college football. Now, 2018, his final year at USC, the offense was bad, 26 points per game, which was 92nd in the country. However, let's look at some of these receivers. So this was the first significant year of Amon-Ra St. Brown. He gave you about 750 yards on 60 catches. Amon-Ra would go on to be an early day 3 pick and become an elite NFL wide receiver. Tyler Vaughn's about 700 yards, and Michael Pittman Jr., 750 yards. Pittman would, of course, go on to be another very relevant NFL player. So over and over again, we're seeing him involved in coaching wide receivers that would go on to have NFL success. 2017, USC's offense is much better. 32.5 points per game, 35th in the country. Deontay Burnett was their number one guy, 86 catches, 1,100 yards. Tyler Vaughn's was next with about 800 yards. Stephen Mitchell with about 650. So not any really big names here. Not really much to speak of with these three in terms of future success. We go back to 2016, which was probably his best year. 34.5 points per game, 36th in the country. Really good offense. This was the USC team that beat Washington, even though Washington made the playoff that year. Juju Smith-Schuster put up 900 yards. Juju would go on to be a very successful NFL player for a while, even if he burned out quickly. 10 touchdowns this year as well. And then you had about 600 yards from Deontay Burnett and about 700 from Darius Rogers. So, some notable players he's involved with here. Even when the results aren't great, and the results were great occasionally, we're talking about a pretty good set of receivers. And you go back to before his stint as the OC, he was the passing game coordinator / wide receiver coach from 2014 to 2015. So 2 years in this role. 2015, the passing game for USC was good, about 270 passing yards a game. And Juju Smith-Schuster had his big breakout year, over 1,450 yards, 90 catches, 10 touchdowns. Stephen Mitchell coming in with about 350 and Darius Rogers with about 300. So not so much there, but Juju Smith-Schuster developing on his watch as a wide receiver coach. In 2014, the USC passing game was elite. They averaged nearly 300 passing yards a game. And look at who else he got to develop during his time as the wide receiver coach in USC. Nelson Agholor would go on to become a first-round pick, have a decent NFL career, win a Super Bowl. Like Nelson Agholor, he didn't become a star at the next level. He has problems as a player, but he was great in college, and he was developed into a first-round pick, in part because of T. Martin. 1,300 yards this year, over 100 catches, 12 touchdowns. Juju Smith-Schuster had a little bit of a breakout year in 2014, 724 yards, 5 touchdowns. And then George Farmer with about 300. And then finally we get all the way back to his early days at USC when he was just the wide receiver coach. 2013 was kind of Nelson Agholor's breakout year, 900 yards, 6 touchdowns. He also had Marquise Lee with about 800 yards. Marquise Lee would go on to play NFL football for Jacksonville. Darius Rogers with about 250 yards of his own. 2012, this was like the big breakout year for Marquise Lee, and also a good year for Robert Woods. Both those guys would go on to be successful NFL players. Marquise Lee had 120 catches, 1,700 yards, 14 touchdowns. Like, it's a great year for him. And Robert Woods gave you about 850, 11 touchdowns, and Nelson Aguilar started to show some flashes of who he was. So look at all these future NFLers. Like, this to me is a positive set of happenings. Before USC, he spent some time at Kentucky with the Wildcats, passing game coordinator and wide receiver coach in 2011. Not much to say here. Kentucky was bad, very bad. They threw the ball for about 136 yards a game. Their top two receivers were LaRod King, who had 600 yards, and Matt Rourke, who had 350. Nothing I can say there, but the year before that, he was just the wide receiver coach, 2010. And look at this. You may remember these names. Randall Cobb was the receiver there, the number one, 84 catches, 1,000 yards, 7 touchdowns. Would go on to have a very good NFL career. Chris Matthews, name that Seahawks fans will probably remember, 61 touchdowns, over 900 yards, 9 touchdowns. Really impressive stuff. And LaRod King was the number 3 this year, so you can see that he lost his top 2 guys going into 2011. LaRod King had almost 500 yards in 2010, by the way. And then you can peel it all the way back, if you really want to the New Mexico Lobos in 2009. Quarterback coach. I don't really have much to say here. His quarterback was Donovan Portery. I don't know who that is. He didn't have a very good year. 2,400 yards, more picks than touchdowns, 57.5% completion, whatever. But that's not really what we care about, right? We care about all this great work with wide receivers, coaching so many future NFLers in his career as a college receiver coach, and then what he's done in the NFL so far, mostly as a quarterback coach for Lamar Jackson. So I don't know how much credit you're going to give him for this stuff, right? It seems to me that the main reason why Lamar Jackson went from a good quarterback to an elite quarterback from 2022 to 2023 is Todd Monken. I think Todd Monken probably had a bigger effect there. But at the same time, you can't say T. Martin's doing anything wrong, especially because you can go back to college and see his great track record of working with some of the most notable receivers in the game. So, let me know what you guys think. This one's interesting. I'm not saying I'm super into it, but what I would say is that there's a lot of good stuff here, a lot more good than bad. And as far as guys who don't have play calling experience go, I think he has to kind of be near the top of the list because this list of experience is positive. At a certain point, you just have to say, if this isn't good enough for you, then maybe nothing will be. All right. Might do another video later today if we get any news. Might not if we don't. Either way, I'll be on Twitch later. See you guys later or tomorrow. Go Hawks. And T. Martin, let me know what you guys think about him, and we'll discuss him further down the line, I'm sure.